We all think we know the near-death experience story, right? You know, the light, the peace, this feeling of ultimate love. It's almost become a cliche.
Mm-hmm.
But what if that idyllic picture, well, isn't the whole story? What if, for a lot of people, actually, brushing with death isn't comforting at all,
Yeah.
but terrifying?
Exactly. That's the side we don't hear about as much.
Today, we're diving into that flip side of the familiar narrative.
Yeah, for every story you hear about a welcoming light, there are these other accounts. Accounts of something far more unsettling. Experiences that leave people feeling not peace, but, well, profound distress, sometimes even trauma.
And that's actually where our listener comes in. You shared some really fascinating research with us that pulls back the curtain on this less talked about reality, distressing near-death experiences, or DNDEs. So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to understand what these experiences actually are, maybe why they happen, and what they tell us that the standard, positive accounts might be missing. We're going deep into the darkness some people encounter right on the edge of life.
And it's really crucial to understand these aren't just like bad dreams or random hallucinations. The research consistently points to shared features, common threads in these distressing experiences.
Okay.
Which suggests they're a real and pretty significant part of the whole near-death phenomenon, not just, isolated weird events.
Right, not just anomalies. So let's start with the basics then. What exactly defines a distressing near-death experience? How is it different from the more common positive ones we hear about?
Well, first, just to recap, a near-death experience, or NDE, generally happens when someone is, physiologically close to dying. Maybe their heart stops, they have a really severe injury or illness, but they survive. And these kinds of events can trigger these profound psychological responses. Sometimes people describe them as transcendental or mystical, like feeling they're outside their physical body, for example.
Okay, yeah, the classic out-of-body experience, the OBE. So where do the distressing experiences diverge from that?
Well, what's really striking is that DNDEs happen in the exact same kinds of life-threatening situations as the positive ones. Cardiac arrest, major trauma, serious illness. It's the same triggers.
Oh, okay.
And maybe even more surprisingly, they often share similar structural elements. We see out-of-body experiences in distressing accounts too. That sense of moving through a tunnel, sometimes even life reviews. They can show up in both positive and negative experiences.
Wow.
Researchers actually have a term for this. They call it gross phenomenological parallelism.
Okay, that sounds technical but important.
Yeah.
Gross phenomenological parallelism. In everyday language, what does that really tell us about how these different experiences might be related?
Essentially, it means the basic framework, the sort of skeleton of the experience, can look very similar whether it ends up feeling positive or negative.
Okay.
The out-of-body feeling, the tunnel, these elements can appear in both scenarios. The crucial difference isn't necessarily what is experienced, like the components, but how it's experienced emotionally, how it's interpreted by the person.
Ah, okay.
So while positive NDEs are typically filled with the sense of overwhelming peace, joy, love, DNDEs are characterized by really intense negative emotions. Fear, panic, anger, confusion, terror, sometimes despair, even deep guilt.
That's the emotional tone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some researchers, Lindley, Bryan, and Conley, they defined a negative NDE simply as one containing extreme fear, panic, or anger. It's that raw emotional quality.
So it's the emotional lens that completely warps the experience, even if some elements look the same on the surface.
Precisely. And unlike positive NDEs, where people often report losing their fear of death entirely, that's generally not the case with DNDEs. The fear can be central. Even something like seeing a light, so often reported as warm and welcoming in positive experiences in a DNDE, that same light might be perceived as threatening or overwhelmingly bright in a scary way, or maybe associated with menacing figures.
It really highlights just how subjective these experiences must be. The same sort of raw data points can be interpreted in drastically different ways.
Exactly right. And that subjective emotional response is what truly defines a DNDE. It also makes trying to objectively categorize them quite complex, What one person finds terrifyingly overwhelming, another might process differently somehow.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes you wonder then just how common these distressing experiences actually are. Are they really rare outliers, or are they a more significant part of the whole picture?
That's a really crucial question. Early research, some of the initial studies and polls suggested they were quite rare. Some estimates put it at less than 1% of all NDEs being negative or distressing.
Less than 1%. Okay, very rare then.
That was the early thinking. But more recent studies, more systematic research, indicates a much higher prevalence, significantly higher. Some research now suggests that DNDEs could account for anywhere from, say, 11% up to maybe 22% of all NDEs reported.
Wow, wait. From less than 1% to potentially over 20%. That's a huge jump.
It is. Some researchers even float figures like possibly as high as 1 in 5 NDEs having distressing elements.
Okay, 1 in 5. That's really significant. What do you think accounts for such a massive difference in our understanding over time? Is it just better research methods or something else?
Well, better methods play a part, definitely. But the overwhelming consensus points towards significant underreporting, especially in the past.
Underreporting. Why?
Well, think about it yourself. If you had an incredibly terrifying experience, one that completely defied the positive, love and light narrative everyone else seems to share, would you be eager to talk about it?
Probably not. I might think something's wrong with me.
Exactly. The sheer horror of the experience itself makes many people reluctant to relive it by telling others. Then there's a deep-seated fear of judgment, fear of being ridiculed or being seen as mentally unstable, or even sometimes people worry they'll be seen as morally flawed, like they somehow deserved a bad experience.
That makes perfect sense. If the accepted story is all positive, a terrifying experience would feel like you failed some kind of cosmic test or did something wrong to cause it.
Precisely. And even the term negative NDE can carry a stigma. People might fear being labeled negatively just for having had the experience.
Yeah.
Some also express a desire to spare their loved ones from what they perceive as dreadful knowledge, the possibility of such terror after death. And as you said, the dominant positive narrative in media and even in early research creates this strong expectation. If your reality was the complete opposite, you might feel like a total anomaly, which can lead to feelings of shame and intense silence.
So this underreporting, it clearly has serious consequences.
Absolutely. For one, it gives us a skewed, incomplete picture of the entire NDE phenomenon. We're missing a big piece of the puzzle. But maybe more importantly, on a personal level, it leaves individuals who've had DNDEs feeling incredibly isolated, misunderstood, and without validation. Imagine trying to process such a profoundly terrifying experience when everyone around you, and maybe even the books you read or the shows you watch, focus solely on the positive aspects. This lack of understanding and support can lead to significant, long-term psychological distress.
That's a really important point. It's the human cost of that silence. So, okay, if these are more common than we thought, what are some of the common types? Do they fall into patterns?
Yes, they do seem to. Researchers like Bruce Grayson and Nancy Evans-Bush, they've done a lot of work outlining several recurring patterns or typologies. This helps us get a better handle on the different ways a near-death experience can become negative or distressing.
Okay, great. Let's delve into those different patterns then. What's the first one?
Probably the most commonly discussed type is what they call the inverted NDE.
Inverted. How so?
Well, what's fascinating here is that it often contains many of the elements we strongly associate with positive NDEs. You might have the out-of-body sensations, see a tunnel, maybe perceive a light, or even feel the presence of other beings.
Okay, the standard features.
Right. But the emotional response is completely reversed, inverted. So instead of peace and joy, the experience is marked by intense distress, fear, panic, and often this feeling of being totally overwhelmed or threatened by what's happening.
So the scenery might look familiar from positive accounts, but the emotional atmosphere is just terrifying.
Exactly. Visually, there might be that tunnel or a light, but maybe the light feels hostile, like it's rushing towards you aggressively, or it feels terrifyingly engulfing. People might perceive shadowy figures or beings that feel distinctly malevolent, and the emotions are just raw. Intense shock, anxiety, this profound sense that something is terribly fundamentally wrong, and a complete lack of control over the situation. There's an example often cited of a man thrown from his horse. He described watching his body from above, then feeling himself hurtling through darkness towards a bright light, passing these shadowy figures he thought might be deceased relatives. But his overwhelming feeling wasn't peace. It was sheer panic at this bizarre, uncontrollable scenario unfolding. The familiar elements were there, but his interpretation was pure distress.
It does sound incredibly unsettling. Familiarity turned hostile.
Okay,
what's another distinct type of distressing NDE?
The next major category identified is often called the void NDE. This one is sometimes described as an encounter with non-existence, or perhaps an eternal empty void.
The void.
Yeah.
Sounds bleak.
It often involves experiencing what feels like a vast, featureless emptiness. Absolute nothingness, or maybe a dark, endless abyss.
Wow. That sounds profoundly isolating.
It is. That's one of the key emotional components. It often brings with it these intense feelings of utter aloneness, deep isolation, and sometimes a terrifying sense of personal annihilation, like the feeling that your very existence was never real or that it's just ceasing to be altogether. Visually, it's frequently described as just total blackness. A deep, empty space with no sense of direction, no boundaries. Sometimes there's this oppressive silence, but other times people report experiencing a sense of screaming internally, but without making any sound.
Oh, wow.
The emotions are extreme. Profound loneliness, discomfort, despair, terror, and that deeply unsettling feeling of being unreal or insignificant. There's an account from a woman during childbirth who found herself flying into this empty space where she felt a presence telling her she had never really existed, that her life was just some kind of illusion.
It's deeply disturbing. Chilling, actually. Taps into really fundamental fears of oblivion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Another man, after being violently attacked, described finding himself in just total blackness, endlessly reflecting on his life, but with this intense feeling of misery and hopelessness, trapped in that empty space with only his thoughts.
Okay. Void NDEs. What's the next type on this spectrum of negative experiences?
Then we have what's often termed the hellish realm NDE. Now, this is the category that most closely aligns with, traditional religious or cultural depictions of hell or underworlds.
Okay, so this is where we might get the fire and brimstone type imagery.
Sometimes literally, yes, but often it's more the core themes. It generally involves perceptions of torment, encounters with beings perceived as malevolent, and tensely negative sensory input across the board.
Right. So what kind of things do people report seeing or hearing?
Visually, people report seeing things like demonic creatures, monstrous figures, beings that seem wrathful or full of hate. Sometimes they see figures they identify explicitly as the devil. They might witness other beings suffering, maybe chained or tormented. The environment itself can be described as dark and oppressive, like underground caves, or it might feature fire, barren, desolate landscapes. Some even mention seeing things like rusty gates that they interpret as the gates of hell.
And the sounds.
Equally horrific, typically. Cries, wails, moans, screams, sometimes gnashing teeth, taunts, hideous laughter, even growling. Unpleasant smells are sometimes reported too, like a foul stench.
Good grief.
And the emotions are just pure terror, panic, agony, and often this overwhelming feeling of being damned or trapped or tricked into being there. Some even report disturbing physical sensations, like feeling pinched or pulled apart or intense pressure. There's an account of a woman who described reaching the entrance of a cave filled with sticky webs, hearing all those terrible sounds, cries and moans, and seeing grotesque beings moving within. Just nightmarish.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. It is striking, though, how some of those images seem to resonate with deep-seated cultural or religious anxieties about punishment.
It is, and that's an important point we'll come back to. While the specific imagery might well be influenced by a person's cultural background or beliefs, the raw terror and the profound distress experienced are very, very real for the individual going through it.
Okay. Are there other main types?
Yes, another significant one is the negative life review NDE. Now, as we know, a life review is a fairly common element in many NDEs, both positive and negative.
Right, where you see your life flash before your eyes.
Exactly. But in these specific distressing cases, the focus of that review is almost entirely on negative events, mistakes the person made, or harm they caused to others.
So instead of a balanced reflection or seeing the good and the bad, it's just like a highlight reel of your worst moments, your regrets, your wrongdoings.
Precisely. And crucially, unlike in some positive life reviews, where even negative events might be reviewed with a sense of understanding or learning or forgiveness, here it's experienced as deeply disturbing, painful, and intensely judgmental. Often it feels like self-judgment, but incredibly harsh. People vividly re-experience their negative actions and, critically, the pain they inflicted on others, sometimes from the other person's perspective. The primary emotions are profound guilt, deep remorse without any comfort, and severe self-condemnation, along with this desperate, urgent need for the review to just stop.
That sounds emotionally devastating. Like being forced to confront the absolute worst parts of yourself with no filter and no sense of redemption offered.
It can be described that way, yes. There's an example of a young woman who, during her NDE, saw herself wearing a white garment, but it was covered in these black spots. And she instinctively understood that these spots represented her evil deeds, her wrongdoings, and she felt this overwhelming remorse and shame looking at them.
Wow, that's powerful symbolism. Okay, so we have inverted void, hellish realms, Negative life reviews. Is that it, or are there overlaps?
Well, that leads to the final category, which acknowledges the overlap: hybrid NDEs.
Hybrid, meaning a mix.
Exactly. These are experiences that contain a mixture of both positive and negative elements. It's not always one or the other. The experience might start out feeling peaceful, blissful even, and then abruptly shift and become terrifying. Or it could go the other way, starting distressing and then resolving into peace. Or sometimes you might have pleasant and distressing moments or scenes sort of occurring intermittently interspersed throughout the whole experience.
So it's not always a clear-cut good or bad experience from start to finish. It can be much more fluid and complex than that.
Exactly right. You might encounter a comforting, loving presence, for instance, but then maybe be shown terrifying realms or scenes of suffering. Or you could be in a beautiful, peaceful setting that's suddenly invaded by a frightening figure or entity. These hybrid cases are particularly important, I think, because they really challenge that simple binary idea of NDEs being either purely positive or purely negative. They suggest a much more dynamic, maybe even unpredictable landscape of near-death consciousness. There was that example of Vera, who initially found herself in this lovely, peaceful, pastoral scene, really idyllic. But then she described entering a church-like building and encountering what she perceived as the devil and seeing fire, which completely shifted the emotional tone of her experience from peace to terror.
Right. So it sounds like across all these different types, inverted, void, hellish, negative review, hybrid may be a recurring theme. Is this profound loss of control, maybe helplessness, in the face of something overwhelming and often hostile?
That's a really critical insight, yes. I think that's spot on. Whether it's seeing familiar elements turn threatening in the inverted NDE, or facing the dissolution of self in the void, or the inescapable torment of the hellish realm, or that relentless self-recrimination in the negative life review, there's very often this deep, pervasive sense of powerlessness.
Yeah.
This lack of agency, the inability to influence or escape these terrifying and often incomprehensible events. It likely contributes significantly to why these experiences are so profoundly distressing and potentially traumatic for people. It contrasts sharply with some positive NDEs, where people sometimes report feeling a sense of choice or agency.
And these aren't just vague feelings or impressions you're describing, are they? The sensory details you mentioned earlier, the sights, the sound, they sound incredibly vivid and intense.
Oh, absolutely. They are reported as being extremely vivid. Across all these different types, there are these recurring core sensory and emotional features that really stand out in the accounts. Visually, as we touched on, darkness is often prominent, sometimes pitch blackness, the emptiness of the void, a dark tunnel, or just an oppressively dark environment.
Right.
Lights, instead of being welcoming or benevolent, can feel threatening, maybe overwhelmingly bright, engulfing in a scary way, or perceived as being on a collision course. And people report seeing these grotesque and frightening figures, things described as demonic, monstrous, wrathful beings, sometimes just featureless shadows, distorted faces, or explicitly the devil.
And the environments.
Disturbing landscapes come up a lot, too. Hellish terrains, desolate plains, dark caves, fire and brimstone imagery, scenes of other suffering. Those rusty gates we mentioned, sometimes even strange things like thick entangling webs.
Okay. And the auditory experiences sound equally, if not more, unsettling.
Indeed. Really unsettling sounds are frequently reported. Things like cries, wails, moans, screams, sometimes a sound described as gnashing teeth, growling, taunts from unseen sources, or hideous laughter.
Chilling.
Sometimes there are specific threatening voices heard, uttering phrases like, "I'm going to get you," or making pronouncements of eternal punishment, or just saying the word hell. And then, in stark contrast, in the void NDE, there's sometimes that chilling experience of absolute silence, or that feeling of silent screaming, the complete inability to vocalize the terror being felt.
Wow. And the emotional impact of all this. It must just be devastating.
Overwhelmingly so, based on the reports. Pervasive fear, panic, and terror are really the hallmarks, often described as a primal kind of fear, unlike any ordinary earthly fear. Sometimes it's described as a fear of finality, of this being it forever. You also see profound despair, hopelessness, misery, the feeling of being trapped in an eternal, terrifying state. Intense sadness and depression can feature. Anger and aggravation come up too. And that overwhelming sense of helplessness, of powerlessness we talked about.
Yeah.
In the void NDEs, that extreme isolation and loneliness are absolutely central. While in the negative life reviews, it's that crushing weight of guilt, remorse, and severe self-judgment that dominates. Confusion, disorientation, shock, the feeling of reality just crumbling that's common too.
It really is almost like the checklist of positive NDE features the peace, the love, the light, the comforting beings is completely flipped on its head, everted like that first type.
Precisely. Threatening light versus benevolent light. Malevolent beings versus benevolent guides or deceased relatives. Terror versus peace. Helplessness versus empowerment. It really underscores that potential duality within the NDE spectrum that we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
And it's usually not just one sense being affected. It's often a multisensory onslaught, horrific sights combined with terrifying sounds, maybe unpleasant smells, and even unpleasant physical sensations. That intense, coherent sensory input really contributes to the perceived reality of it all, and likely to the potential for lasting trauma.
You mentioned physical sensations as well. What kind of physical feelings do people report in these DNDEs?
Yes, it's not just visual and auditory. Some individuals report really unpleasant physical feelings. Things like being dragged or chased or pinched, sometimes even feeling like they're being torn apart.
Oh my goodness.
There can be sensations of intense pressure or falling endlessly, sometimes being in environments that feel intensely cold or dark or watery and suffocating. Altered perceptions of time are also quite common, like the experience lasting for an eternity or being trapped in unbearable time loops.
Eternity in that state.
Exactly. Some report feelings of paranoia. And even the out-of-body sensation, which is usually associated with peace and detachment in positive NDEs, can sometimes be accompanied by intense panic in a distressing context. Numbness is sometimes mentioned too. And as I noted, unpleasant smells, like a foul stench, are occasionally reported, particularly in those scenarios described as hellish.
It's interesting. You mentioned earlier the potential cultural influence on the imagery, especially in the hellish realm NDEs. Does that connection to cultural tropes like demons or hellfire in any way diminish the reality of those experiences for the individuals who have them? Does it make them less real?
That's a really crucial point to address. While it seems likely, even probable, that the specific visual language and the symbols encountered in some DNDEs, particularly the hellish ones, might be shaped or filtered through the individual's existing cultural and religious frameworks.
Okay.
That absolutely does not diminish the profound reality or the impact of the experience for the person going through it. The form the experience takes might be influenced by these pre-existing mental models, these cultural templates we carry around. But the underlying terror, the distress, the conviction that something profoundly real and deeply negative has occurred that is intensely genuine for the experiencer.
So the brain might be using familiar, albeit terrifying, metaphors to try and process something utterly unfamiliar.
That's one way to think about it, yes. It's as if the mind, when confronted with something potentially beyond ordinary comprehension, perhaps draws upon the most potent available symbolic language it has access to, even if that language is derived from cultural depictions of fear and punishment. But the core feeling, the raw experience, is the crucial part.
Right. And you also highlighted earlier something really important. The lack of a clear link between having a DNDE and a person's moral character or their actions in life. That seems like a really vital point to emphasize, again, given the hellish imagery and negative life reviews.
Absolute critical. Despite some interpretations, especially folk interpretations, that might quickly try to link negative NDEs, particularly those negative life reviews or hellish realms, directly to past wrongdoings or a bad life.
Yeah, the idea you get the afterlife you deserve.
Right. But the research, when you look at it systematically, consistently shows that DNDEs, in general, do not neatly correlate with a person's conventional morality or behavior. As one summary of the research puts it quite starkly, saints have reported extremely disturbing NDEs, while felons and suicide attempters have encountered bliss.
Wow. That really throws a wrench in simplistic explanations.
It absolutely does. It challenges any easy, judgmental conclusions and strongly suggests that far more complex factors are likely at play. These could be psychological factors, transpersonal dynamics, perhaps neurobiological processes we don't fully understand yet, or maybe some combination of all of these. It's definitely not a simple case of cosmic reward and punishment based on earthly deeds.
This has all been incredibly intense to consider. It really leads to the question of how real these distressing encounters actually feel to the people who experience them. I mean, afterwards, do they tend to dismiss them as just,
Well, it's interesting you ask that because it's quite the contrary, actually. Just like people who have profoundly positive NDEs, those who experience distressing NDEs frequently, almost universally, report that their experience felt unequivocally real. Often they emphasize it felt more real than their normal, everyday waking consciousness. Some even use that specific phrase you hear in NDE research, realer than real.
Realer than real.
Yeah.
Even for the terrifying ones.
Even for the terrifying ones. And this powerful conviction of authenticity, this sense that it wasn't just a dream or hallucination, is a very significant factor. It contributes hugely to the lasting impact and, unfortunately, sometimes the potential for lasting trauma associated with DNDEs.
So they're definitely not just shrugging these experiences off afterwards like, oh, that was a bad nightmare.
Not at all, generally speaking. And research backs this up. Studies looking at the characteristics of NDE memories have shown that the memories of distressing NDEs are often just as phenomenologically rich in detail as those of positive ones.
Meaning they remember them clearly, with lots of detail.
Exactly. They aren't typically vague, fragmented, or easily dismissed recollections like dreams often are. This intense sensory and emotional richness contributes to why they feel so real and have such a lasting impact.
Okay.
And while research specifically on the, say, neural correlates of negative NDE memories is still pretty limited, studies looking at generally positive or neutral NDE memories have indicated they have distinct neural patterns compared to memories of imagined events. This suggests, at least for NDEs broadly, that these experiences are processed by the brain in a way that's different from mere fabrication or imagination.
It sounds like that intense feeling of reality is precisely what can make these experiences so deeply life-altering, sometimes perhaps for the better in a strange way, but often causing real distress.
Precisely. Because they feel so profoundly real, these experiences can prompt significant life changes. We talked about the example of Dee, who apparently left an abusive relationship after her terrifying NDE gave her a stark wake-up call. But equally, you have cases like Karen, whose ongoing fear of eternal darkness after her void experience illustrates the potential for long-term negative impact. And even when scientists explore potential physiological explanations for elements of NDEs, like, say, temporal lobe activity or changes in brain chemistry under stress, the subjective feeling of realness and its profound personal impact on the individual still needs to be deeply understood and acknowledged. Just focusing on reductionist, purely physiological explanations often completely misses the personal meaning, the existential weight, and the lasting effects these experiences have on people's lives.
Yeah, it doesn't explain the content or the meaning it holds for the person.
Exactly.
And I imagine if someone does try to seek therapy or support to process such a deeply real feeling and disturbing experience, but it gets dismissed by a professional as unreal or just a hallucination or side effect of drugs, that could be incredibly invalidating and potentially quite harmful.
Absolutely. Validation of the perceived reality of the experience is utterly crucial for effective support and integration. If a therapist or a doctor or even family member dismisses it as just a hallucination or you were just oxygen deprived, it fundamentally invalidates the experiencer's deeply felt reality. And that can severely hinder their healing process. It can lead to further isolation, maybe make them shut down completely, and reinforce that profound sense of being misunderstood or alone with this terrifying knowledge.
This has been a truly profound and, I have to say, quite sobering deep dive into a side of near-death experiences that really does often remain hidden in the shadows.
It really has. And I think it's clear that distressing NDEs are a significant and incredibly complex part of the overall near-death experience spectrum. They encompass this really diverse range of terrifying sensory and emotional encounters, from the unsettling familiarity of the inverted NDE to the profound nothingness of the void, the raw torment of hellish realms, that brutal self-confrontation in negative life reviews, and also the complex, sometimes confusing interplay we see in the hybrid states.
It really does challenge the predominantly positive view that we, so often hear about in popular culture and even in some earlier research. It underscores this critical need for a much more nuanced, a much more comprehensive understanding of consciousness itself and what happens, or perhaps what we perceive happens when we brush against the very boundaries of life.
Absolutely. And it highlights that further rigorous research into DNDs is really essential. Despite the inherent challenges, posed by the underreporting we discussed and the obviously sensitive nature of the topic,
Right.
We collectively need to try and cultivate a more supportive and understanding environment, both in healthcare settings and in society generally, so that individuals feel safe and feel validated in sharing these profoundly impactful, even if terrifying, experiences. And as we've discussed, the urgent need for specialized support for therapeutic approaches that actually acknowledge and validate the perceived reality of these encounters, well, that really cannot be overstated. Dismissal is just not helpful.
No, clearly not. So as we draw this deep dive to a close, I'm left with a really compelling, maybe even unsettling thought for you, the listener, to ponder. Given the undeniable existence of these profoundly negative near-death experiences alongside the positive ones, how might that fundamentally reshape our understanding of consciousness itself? And maybe the very nature of reality as we perceive it, and ultimately our own personal confrontation with mortality. What does it truly mean if our most fundamental experiences, right at the very edge of life, can be so extraordinarily varied, so intensely felt, encompassing both the potential heights of bliss and the potential depths of unimaginable terror?
Yeah.
It certainly invites a significant amount of further personal reflection, I think, and exploration into these incredibly profound and sometimes dark mysteries of human experience.